Hi there. Today we're going to be having a look at something very near and dear to my heart. What we have here is a family heirloom that I inherited from my grandmother a number of years ago. Now, as far as the background of it, well, as you can tell, it's a sword, but it's the story behind it that's the most interesting part. So this is the letter of provenance that my grandmother was kind enough to write up for me when I took possession of the item. Bernard Rogers graduated in agriculture and left Vancouver in September of 1941 to accept a job in Singapore. In December, the Japanese invaded, with the city and area falling on February 15th of 1942. At first, most prisoners were herded into Changi prison. Then work groups were formed, and individuals were sent to dockyards, mines, and the Burma-Thailand Railway. Initially, Bernard Rogers was sent to work on the railway. After some years there, he was shipped to Japan to work in the coal mines north of Tokyo. There, all prisoners were made to make swords for the Japanese population to defend themselves in the event of an attack. In August of 1945, the first atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima. After the second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, Japan surrendered. All prisoners were repatriated, hospitalized, and then sent home after they were well enough to travel. Bernard brought back the sword he had made. He never regained his health, suffering from severe asthma, low weight, and general weakness. He died in 1978 of heart failure, being found 4 days after his death. So based on the letter of provenance here that my grandmother drew up, this item was to be one of the latch-stitch weapons for the Japanese civilian population. However, from what my grandfather had said before he passed, apparently they may have also intended to use these as weapons for him himself to fight against the Americans in the event of an occupation of the Japanese home islands. Apparently, the Japanese had established basically drafted prisoner labor, units of some form or other, which were to be pushed against the Americans with blocking units employed to basically force them to fight and risk death if they were to try and retreat. Honestly, it was a very grim and horrific time in history. Now, as to the sword itself, I have to say, you may notice there is quite a bit of damage to the outer sheath, and that's largely my own fault, to be frank. I remember as a kid, this thing was in my grandma's attic, along with an old American Civil War cavalry sword, which apparently someone had used at some point for Scottish Highland dancing. Anyway, me being the right terror that I was as a child, I remember playing with this thing, and you'll notice all these little scratch marks on the sheath, and that, I must confess, is entirely my own fault. Me hacking away at it like some crazy person at the age of 3 or 4. Yeah, this is a lesson here. Never let your children have access to your precious family heirlooms until they are of the appropriate age. The sword itself was in perfect condition in basically a sealed plastic bag in the attic for years. And then after I came into possession of it, again, you'll notice the blade as well appears to have some rust. That, however, was not my fault. That problem lies at the behest of my younger brother, who a number of years ago decided to take this thing without my permission into the backyard and start hacking apart fruit with it. I was livid. He chopped little fruit and things into pieces and then shoved the sword back in the sheath without washing it, and rust resulted. And then later on, he tried doing it again, and instead of putting oil on the blade because he wanted to clean it, he decided to pour water into the sheath itself, and then shoved the blade back in. So, of course, it got pretty thoroughly rusted from that. I was not thrilled. So, in order to solve that problem, I decided to buy a pretty cheap sword for about $60 Canadian just for him to play with. And that's this one here. This second sword is strictly intended as a display piece, and I only paid $60 Canadian, and as you can tell, he's kind of used and abused that to a fair extent, and this one actually has rust on it as well now. Still, as an insurance policy against potential further damage to a priceless family heirloom, it was well worth it. Now, in addition to that letter of provenance that my grandmother wrote, I have a suitcase in my closet containing various documents regarding Bernard Rogers himself, including his, I'd say, academic transcripts from the University of British Columbia, and a number of other documents. Suffice it to say, the item is legitimate, and the story is true. Still, just picturing a bunch of drafted slave soldiers. Just the same, the prospect of a few thousand, or possibly even 100,000 slave soldiers charging headlong into American machine gun fire under threat of blocking units. Christ, it's a terrifying prospect. Still, thankfully that never happened, and we're all the better for it, I would say. In either case, thank you for joining us, and see you next time. Auf Wiedersehen.